Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on revival circuits, reform print, and the politics of antebellum change. The core question is this: when moral complaint becomes organized reform, who gains leverage and who gets disciplined by the same machinery? The core competency is to cite examples of the religious, literary, and philosophical innovations and reform movements of mid-century America. When moral complaint becomes organized reform, who gains leverage and who gets disciplined by the same machinery? During the first half of the 19th century, Americans built an energetic reform culture that reached through churches, newspapers, petition drives, lecture halls, voluntary societies, and conventions. Movements for temperance, abolition, prison reform, asylum reform, public education, and women's rights did not remain private moral opinions. They became organized campaigns. This changed the structure because reform changed the public square. Citizens increasingly acted as if social wrongs could be documented, circulated, and pressured through collective effort. The Second Great Awakening supplied much of the era's religious energy. Evangelical preachers traveled on circuits, held camp meetings, and called listeners to conversion. Salvation was presented as immediate and personal, but the message often extended outward. If individuals could repent, then communities and institutions could also be changed. That conviction encouraged reform. People did not stop with personal piety. They organized societies to attack drunkenness, prostitution, prison abuse, slavery, and educational neglect. Reform belonged to democracy because it widened the number of people entering public argument. Women who lacked the vote still organized fairs, circulated petitions, published essays, hosted meetings, and built associations. Black abolitionists used newspapers, speeches, and conventions to challenge slavery and racial discrimination. Ministers, lecturers, editors, and local organizers created issue publics that crossed state lines. Reform therefore grew through communication systems as much as through belief. Some of the era's reform language also drew strength from older Republican ideas about virtue and from newer evangelical beliefs about moral responsibility. A citizen or church member was expected to help cleanse society of vice and abuse and to avoid sin privately. This expectation widened the reach of public criticism. Drinking, prison discipline, prostitution, school neglect, and slavery became topics for organized scrutiny rather than only household gossip or local embarrassment. The revival circuits of the early republic depended on route, repetition, and local support. Methodist and Baptist itinerants traveled from settlement to settlement. Camp meetings gathered hundreds or sometimes thousands of people for days of sermons, prayer, singing, and testimony. Organizers arranged food, shelter, speaking order, and space. Families traveled to attend. News spread before and after the events. These meetings created momentum because they repeated emotional experience in structured ways. Religious enthusiasm was mobile because there was a logistical system underneath it. Print enlarged that system. Newspapers reprinted sermons, speeches, and reform arguments. Tract societies issued inexpensive pamphlets for wide distribution. The American Bible Society and the American Tract Society used subscription, printing, and shipping networks to move literature into homes and towns across the country. Cheap print made reform portable. A speech given in one city could shape opinion in another. A petition text could be copied and circulated. A convention declaration could become a national controversy through reprinting alone. Voluntary associations turned scattered conviction into coordinated action. Members paid dues, elected officers, drafted constitutions, scheduled meetings, raised funds, and tracked membership. These were working institutions. They kept minutes, printed reports, and formed local chapters. Reform, therefore, did not spread only because ideas were powerful. It spread because organizations learned how to store effort and repeat it. A tract society, anti-slavery association, or temperance chapter could continue after one charismatic speaker left town. These developments also fit a broader antebellum setting. The same market and transport changes that moved goods more efficiently also moved ideas. Canals, roads, post offices, and expanding newspaper circulation made it easier to send pamphlets, petitions, and speakers outward. Antebellum reform was not outside the market revolution. It traveled through some of the same systems. Educational reform added another layer. Horace Mann in Massachusetts argued for better funded public schools, trained teachers, and standardized instruction. Common school reform did not solve inequality, but it showed another way antebellum Americans tried to remake society through institution building. School boards, tax support, normal schools, and curriculum debates placed reform inside government structures as well as voluntary ones. William Lloyd Garrison stands at one major reform point. In 1831, he began publishing The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper that demanded immediate emancipation. Garrison rejected colonization schemes that proposed removing free Black Americans from the United States. He described slavery as a moral crime requiring urgent condemnation. His newspaper created leverage because it created a regular channel for abolitionist argument. Subscribers, reprints, and public reaction made the issue harder to contain. Garrison's approach also brought backlash. Mobs attacked abolitionist speakers and presses in several northern cities. Reform print carried risk as well as reach. Black abolitionists transformed the movement further. Frederick Douglass, born enslaved in Maryland, escaped and became one of the era's most important speakers and writers. His speeches and autobiography gave concrete testimony about slavery's violence, labor regime, and literacy restrictions. Sojourner Truth spoke with force about slavery, religion, and women's status. Black conventions, mutual aid networks, and abolitionist newspapers showed that reform did not belong to white moral leadership alone. Black activists supplied analysis, evidence, and institutional labor. Dorothea Dix worked through inspection and documentation. In the 1840s, she visited jails, almshouses, and asylums and gathered evidence about mistreatment of the mentally ill. She then presented memorials to legislatures, especially in Massachusetts, urging state-supported institutions and reform. Her method created leverage. She inspected, recorded, and petitioned. Reform here moved through fact-gathering and official response rather than revival preaching. The state became the target of evidence. Women's rights organizing took shape through overlap with abolition and reform culture. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott met in anti-slavery circles and later helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. The convention format gave reformers leverage because it created agenda, debate, resolutions, and a public document. Seneca Falls did not appear out of nowhere. Married women's property disputes, educational barriers, exclusion from professions, and limits on public speaking had been building pressure for years. Reform networks supplied the organizational habits needed to turn that pressure into a formal meeting with lasting documentary weight. Temperance reform also deserves attention because it reveals reform's disciplinary side. Campaigners argued that alcohol destroyed families, wages, health, and moral order. Temperance societies collected pledges, printed literature, and staged lectures. The movement sought protection from genuine social harm, especially domestic violence and poverty linked to heavy drinking. It also sought to regulate behavior. Reform could therefore widen care and tighten supervision at the same time. Abolitionists likewise disagreed over means. Some favored moral suasion and denunciation. Others later emphasized party action, voting, and legal change. Churches split over slavery. Newspapers battled over colonization, immediatism, and the role of women speakers. Reform culture was energetic because it was organized, but it was also fractured because different reformers counted evidence, urgency, and respectability in different ways. The Declaration of Sentiments, adopted at Seneca Falls in 1848, works as the central source because it places women's grievances inside the language of American founding principles. The text deliberately echoes the Declaration of Independence by stating that all men and women are created equal. That line echoed familiar words and forced readers to confront the gap between national principle and legal practice. The document then lists injuries. It objects to women's exclusion from the elective franchise, unequal education, subordinate status in marriage, and denial of many professional opportunities. The famous phrase describing married women as civilly dead points directly to law. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was heavily constrained through her husband's status. Property control, contract capacity, and public independence could all be limited. The Declaration operates through concrete grievance rather than uplift alone. The Declaration also shows how reform and print culture interacted. A convention document was made to circulate. Newspapers could condemn it as absurd or dangerous. Supporters could reprint it, debate it, and carry it into later meetings. A local gathering became a national argument because print networks existed to move it. That same process had already helped abolitionists, temperance advocates, and religious reformers. The Declaration also reveals limits. Not everyone at Seneca Falls agreed equally on every demand. The suffrage resolution itself was controversial even among some supporters. Wider American society reacted with mockery and hostility. The Declaration did not solve exclusion. It documented it and made it harder to ignore. That difference sharpens the function of reform documents. Reform documents often begin by naming what institutions refuse to repair. The Declaration also exposes how reformers borrowed legitimacy from the founding while indicting the Republic for failing its own terms. That tactic was powerful because Americans already treated the Declaration of Independence as civic scripture. By rewriting that script for women, Stanton and her allies forced opponents either to deny the language of equality or to narrow it openly. Antebellum reform left a large institutional footprint. It made voluntary associations central to public life. It taught citizens to sign petitions, found newspapers, attend conventions, circulate tracts, and pressure legislatures. It created habits of organization that later movements would inherit. Abolitionists used those habits against slavery. Women's rights organizers used them against legal inequality. Educational and prison reformers used them to demand state action. The period also exposed the mixed character of reform. Abolition demanded liberty and equal humanity, yet even anti-slavery coalitions could fracture over race and political strategy. Temperance could shield families from violence while also stigmatizing the poor or immigrant drinking cultures. Revival religion could widen participation and emotional authority while still insisting on strict moral codes. Reform did not move in one direction. It widened public action and moral scrutiny together. Government entered the picture more directly as reformers targeted law and institutions. Dix petitioned legislatures. Anti-slavery petitions flooded Congress and helped trigger the House gag rule in the 1830s. Women's rights advocates challenged marriage law, education access, and eventually suffrage barriers. Reform, therefore, did not remain outside politics. It pushed into policy, legislative procedure, and constitutional debate. This period belongs near the center of antebellum history because it shows Americans learning how to organize public pressure before the Civil War. The same republic that expanded markets and territory also expanded associational conflict. Citizens argued over slavery, drink, prison conditions, schooling, marriage, and religious duty using coordinated structures. Reform became one of the ways democracy operated between elections. The record from revival circuits, newspapers, petitions, memorials, and conventions shows how conscience became durable only when it acquired infrastructure. Feeling alone could fade. A society with officers, dues, printers, and schedules could keep pressing. Antebellum reform reshaped public action because Americans learned how to build those structures and how to turn moral complaint into repeated public action. The Reform era also left behind a political vocabulary that later generations would use again. Petition, rights, equal treatment, improvement, and moral responsibility all gained sharper public meanings in this period. Those words gained force because they could be attached to institutions. A petition entered legislative files. A convention issued resolutions. A newspaper preserved charges in print. Reform became durable when it left records governments and critics had to answer. By the late 1840s, reform culture had become one of the normal ways Americans entered public life. A person might join a church society, subscribe to an abolitionist paper, sign a temperance pledge, attend a lecture, contribute to a fair, or debate a convention resolution without ever holding office. That pattern broadened the civic field. It also meant that public conflict increasingly moved through associations that claimed moral authority over work, family, sexuality, religion, and law. The antebellum record therefore deserves to be read as a history of machinery as much as conviction. Printing presses, subscription lists, lecture calendars, dues books, meeting minutes, petition bundles, and convention proceedings carried reform farther than enthusiasm alone could have carried it. Once those tools were in place, reformers could return again and again to the same issue until officials, churches, editors, or voters answered. Those records remained politically useful. Reform became durable once it had presses, petitions, lecture circuits, dues, and convention machinery behind it. The harder judgment is whether those same tools and large democratic pressure are taught Americans new ways to discipline one another in the name of moral improvement. Organized virtue never arrives without arguments over power.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.